Hello, I am Husain Haqqani from the Hudson Institute, and we have an interesting discussion for you today about Dr. Harlan Ullman's new book, The Fifth Horseman and the New MAD. And MAD in this case stands for Massive Attacks of Disruption. Over the last few years, the world has witnessed a global pandemic, cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, extreme weather, the war in Ukraine, the potential for conflict over Taiwan. Is the world, and particularly the United States, prepared for what may lie ahead? These are the questions that Dr. Harlan Ullman asks in his latest book. The subtitle of the book is How Massive Attacks of Disruption Became the Looming Existential Danger to a Divided Nation and the World at Large. The book came out in December 2021. Dr. Ullman is the author of 11 books. He's a strategic thinker, a former naval officer who commanded a destroyer in the Persian Gulf, and has advised heads of government and industry. He's senior advisor at the Atlantic Council and is UPI's Arnaud de Bourgegrave Distinguished Columnist. The main running theme of the book is that a fifth horseman of the apocalypse threatens us all. In his book, Dr. Ullman touches upon the COVID-19 pandemic and even the January 6 events in Washington, D.C. and the storming of the U.S. Capitol, which he cites as proof of massive attacks of disruption, things that are not necessarily predicted or are on anybody's radar. To discuss the book, we have two very distinguished discussants. Susan Eisenhower is a policy analyst, an essayist, op-ed writer, biographer, and editor. She is chairman emeritus of the Eisenhower Group, a consulting firm. She served for 8 years on the National Academy of Sciences Standing Committee on International Security and Arms Control. Her latest book, How Ike Led, the Principles Behind Eisenhower's Biggest Decisions, came out in 2020. The Honorable Dov Zakheim is senior advisor to the Center for Strategic and International Studies and senior fellow at the CNA Corporation. From 2001 to 2004, he was Undersecretary of Defense and Chief Financial Officer for the Department of Defense. And from 2002 to 2004, he was also DoD's coordinator of civilian programs in Afghanistan. Dr. Zakheim is the author of numerous books, monographs, and articles, and I'm a regular reader of his op-eds in The Hill. So, before we start our discussion, Harlan, try and tell us what is the main thesis of your book? What do you want to achieve by writing it? How do you want people to respond to your notion of massive attacks of disruption?
First, I want to thank the Hudson Institute and you, Husain Haqqani, and our distinguished colleagues here, Susan and Dov. Thank you very much, because I think this is going to be a broader discussion. To answer your question, Husain, massive attacks of disruption are no longer a looming existential danger. In the years since I finished the first and last draft, the situation has completely deteriorated far more than I had expected. The book argues that mutual assured destruction of the Cold War was superseded by massive attacks of disruption, and you pointed out some, both acts of man and acts of nature. Now there's another MAD on the block, M-A-D-D, not mothers against drunk driving, but massive attacks of disruption and destruction. I argue in the book that there are at least 7 major disruptions. The most powerful and the most dangerous is failed and failing government. Here we are on Pennsylvania Avenue, and both ends are in great trouble, the White House and Congress. Both parties are failing. Then there's climate change. And whether you agree with climate change or not, as we're having this session, Hurricane Fiona has just taken all the lights out of Puerto Rico, and Ian has done the same thing in Cuba and many southern states. And elsewhere, we see huge droughts, we see floods, we see catastrophes that are all due to natural sources. Then there's social media and cyber, which are enormously disruptive. You can put deep fakes on the internet and ruin any of our lives because we cannot disprove what's there. We also don't understand that perhaps the next big disruptor is going to be terror, but domestic terror rather than international terror. Then there's debt. We have 150% of GDP in debt, with more debt accumulating. Interest rates are going up, and we're going to find that at some stage, we're going to be spending more in interest payments than we are on virtually anything else, and we can't afford it. And last, drones. In my book, the preface is 2029, when a lady president takes office, not at the Capitol, not at the White House, because both have been destroyed by drone attacks. And she's in a concrete bunker, actually a concrete iceberg underground in an undisclosed location. We're seeing what's happening, for example, in Ukraine, but elsewhere in Iran with drones. These things are unregulated, and they're going to be potentially disastrous if they're not controlled. Now, the book also has 3 chapters on Putin and Xi, which did not predict what's happening in Ukraine, but it did suggest that Putin may take over Snake Island in the Black Sea as a way of threatening Ukraine, and he's obviously done a great deal more. There's also a chapter that compares the Spanish flu of 1918, 1920, and today, which is a contrast between societies, but there are 2 observations that are important. One, having had an experience of a pandemic 100 years ago, we've learned nothing. And what are we doing about COVID-20 or 21? Second, after the pandemic was over, 1921, 22, 23, we had the greatest economic boom in our history. Why? It was because of Henry Ford and Walter Chrysler, among other things. And so automobiles revolutionized part of the economy. And of course, there were new technologies such as radio and aviation that really took over. From that, one of the conclusions I draw in the book is for a national infrastructure bank. We put aside a couple of $1 trillion for infrastructure, which is sorely needed. We need to transition from the 20th century or even the 19th century to the 21st. That money is going to be wasted in large part because there's no oversight. And so what I've argued for in a national infrastructure bank is to do what we did during World War II with war bonds. That is to say, people will invest in these bonds. We can probably raise $2 or $3, $4 trillion. We pay 2 or 3% above prime. And the way we guarantee repayment is, as we did with the Troubled Asset Relief Program in 2008-9 after the financial crisis, we take shares and warrants into companies in which we invest. It is absolutely crazy, for example, to give Intel all this money to manufacture chips. Why don't you do this as some kind of an investment or a loan so that it's repaying? The biggest problem we face is obviously government. Both political parties are at a stage right now where hatred is really the coin of the realm. And worse than that, we projected that elsewhere. We're turning China into an enemy, and I go into ways that we should reverse that. And even though Putin has certainly given us just cause, in many ways we have no lines of communication with Russia that are sorely needed. And I argue for that needs to be done in the book. I'll say a couple of words. One of the things I list in the book are several scenarios to reflect each of the disruptors. And I predicted how Donald Trump would distort the system to be able to take over the government. And the way that that can be done now is through something that's very arcane called the 1887 Electoral Voting Act, which is so vague that it's a huge ticking time bomb in our Constitution. Now, there's legislation on the Hill. I'm not sure it's been passed yet, but Congress is going out of session. That, to me, is the number one thing, and I argue for that in my book, to be done now, along with not only passing a continual resolution, but we've got to go to some way of having a consistent budget. Because every time, and Dov was the former controller of the Pentagon, what does this cost us in inefficiency? 10, 15%, it's absurd. Let me also conclude on something that's of great value to us. We are headed to a hollow force in the military. And the reason I say that, we'll spend maybe $850 billion a year on defense. But what's happened is several things. First, The regulatory system is so convoluted and so destructive, it had to be put in place by the KGB because no sane person would do that. It makes it almost impossible for the Pentagon to react. But more importantly, there are inbuilt, uncontrolled annual real cost growths in the Pentagon of at least 5 to 7%. Why? Because this technology, which is marvelous, spectacular, is expensive. A Ford aircraft carrier costs $15 billion. That's without the air wing. An F-35 costs $100 million a pop. We're decommissioning Navy frigates, literal combat ships that cost over $500 million a year because they're just not working. On top of that, we're having huge problems recruiting and retaining people in the military. And I argue in the book for a form of what I call the porcupine defense, which really takes how the Ukrainians have been dealing with the Russians to be able to prevent an attack and combine that with what we call combined arms, which is the ability to seize and retake territory. And I think we can do that for a military of perhaps under $1 million and possibly $600 billion a year. And I say that because we're going to have an enormous budget crisis, and the military is one of the last institutions in the country that are trustworthy. I asked the audience to name more than one or two institutions that they trust, and you can't do it. While the situation today looks dire, the book is optimistic because Americans have the intellectual capital, the innovation, and the intellect to be able to deal with these things. So my plea in the book for readers, read the book, understand the situation that is dire, but also understand that action is needed. And Americans are going to have to demand of their government that they put aside all these political differences of party, put country above party, and see over the coming months and years if we can turn America back to a place where future generations will have the same benefits that we have had. I'd like to turn this over to my colleagues because I'm very interested, not so much in their questions, but in their reaction, because our purpose here is to see how we get America back on track. MAD is no longer a looming existential danger. It is a real existential danger. We have to understand and take action if future America is going to be as safe, prosperous, and secure as America has been in the past.
Good. So basically, for anybody who thinks that this is a pessimistic take on how the world is, the optimism comes from what you define as new intellectual, conceptual, political, and practical approaches.
Absolutely.
Susan, let's start. You've read the book. Are you one of those who feels that it's just very pessimistic because the practical approaches that are needed are just not going to be able to find the political consensus that is needed? Or do you think that we do have a way out? First, are we facing the massive attacks of disruption, which Harlan very eloquently listed just now? And if we are we prepared for them?
Well, I must say, first of all, again, thank you for this opportunity to be on this panel, because I want to say that I think Harlan's written a remarkable book and extraordinarily important for people to read. What I like about it is he sets out the problems, but also has recommendations. I think one of the biggest problems we're facing today is this kind of defeatism that never rallies people or brings them together. You can't inspire troops to go into combat if you tell them they're going to lose the war before they go into battle. I mean, we need to have politicians not only who put the country first, but know how to create a sense of optimism. You're seeing the effects of this negativity among all age groups, but it's especially worrying for me among the students of our country. I mean, we've got an educational system that is not producing the way it should, not for the money we spend on it. So this practical approach I'm in complete agreement with. The other thing is that I think is really important is that Harlan has organized this in a way to help you think of this as like spinning tops, okay? And we've got so many tops spinning right now with no philosophy behind how to address these problems, no strategy for how to find the points of leverage that could make an enormous difference in the outcome. The best strategies of all are the ones that accomplish more than one goal at the same time. And this is exactly the kind of thinking that we have to have more of in this country. If we're going to have all of these opportunities to spend gigantic amounts of money to solve these, then we better start thinking about exactly the kind of practical approaches that Harlan has outlined.
Dov?
Well, I've known Harlan a very long time, and what has always struck me about him is he never runs out of ideas. And this book is so chock full of them. Now, some of them you may think are impractical. Some of them you may think just can't happen. But I wrote down a list of the things that I think are possible because
Sure,
I
share
want
that.
our listeners who haven't read the book just to start thinking about what really could be doable even under the current crazy circumstances we're living in. And so in no great particular order, Harlan's got a bunch of ideas about how to restructure government, okay? He starts off making the vice president a kind of prime minister, somebody who can really get the whole government working together, which is one of the biggest problems we've got. Then he says, you've got and this again just shows you how dysfunctional we've become. We've got a National Security Council. We've got an Economic Security Council. And yet, how do you distinguish economics from national security? I'll give you an example of yesterday, of this week. Putin clearly has blown holes in pipelines. Is that economics or is that national security? The answer is, it's both. Harlan recommends combining the two. Makes a lot of sense, totally doable. Another problem, we cannot get the best people we want to get. It takes you forever. When I got confirmed, it took me about, just under 3 months. Turns out that's the speed of light. And I actually was given a T-shirt that said, I survived the confirmation process. Now, how do you get the best and the brightest to want to do that, to want to go through that kind of hell? Harlan says, quite rightly, you got to speed up the confirmations. You've got to make it much more difficult for people to stand in the way, members of Congress, members of the Senate to stand in the way. Absolutely right. Another one that's totally doable. We've got a whole bunch of combatant commands. We actually just started our own separate command the other day to support Ukraine. We're creating commands all the time. Harlan says, wait a minute. We shouldn't be adding to them. We should be streamlining them. I'll give you an example. We've got a Southern Command, we've got a Northern Command. South America, North America. Why don't you just have an America's Command? Perfectly sensible, at least to me. Harlan's deeply concerned about drones, and he's absolutely right. Why do we not have any legislation, any kind of control over what people do, how they get hold of drones, what they do with drones? It's all scattershot. It's a real problem. It can be fixed. Part of the bigger problem is we don't have a strategy. It's very difficult if you don't have any idea of how you want to go from here to there because you don't know what your there is. Again, not something that's impossible, not something that this government can do. Supreme Court, a lot of issues about that, a lot of concern. It's gotten very politicized. I mean, every time there's a vote in the Supreme Court, what are the Times and the Post report? The liberals voted this way, and the conservatives voted that way. That's not what the Supreme Court's supposed to be like. One thing you can do, Harlan suggests it, it's not packing the court, it's term limits. If you know you're going to leave after a period of time, maybe you'll be a little more sensible. If you think you're going to be there forever, you just don't care. Doable. Another issue. Harlan rightly lists all these disruptors that you talked about. But we don't have single agencies that take full responsibility for those disruptors. Somebody who's actually in charge. Now, how do you make people in charge? 2 ways. Accountability and give them the budgets. Being a former green eye shade, I worry about these things. But if you don't control the money, you don't control anything. Right. But Harlan's absolutely right. You have to have one point, one agency that's in charge, that's responsible, that has the money, and not spread things around so that we constantly don't know how to walk and chew gum at the same time. And finally, if you're talking about new policies, why don't we have a cyber policy? Why don't we have a social media policy? Social media has disrupted our elections, for God's sake. We get these people who are in charge of Google or Facebook or whatever. They testify in front of Congress. They say all kinds of mealy-mouthed, nice, sugar-coated things. Nothing gets done. Why can't it get done? So that's just a few. And my point is he's got so many ideas. Some I don't think are particularly practical. You're not going to get members of Congress sitting on executive branch committees because that's a separation of powers issue. Some of this just can't happen, but an awful lot of them can. And what I'm emphasizing, you got to read the book. Think of all his ideas and then think about what you can do about them.
Okay, so Dov and Susan, and Harlan, you can jump into this as well. Here are two sets of issues that I think follow from what you two have said. One, the political feasibility of it all. In a polarized polity, how do you get new ideas on the table? Because one of the hallmarks of polarization is that people have taken a position and they're stuck to it. Second, how reconcilable is the idea of reforming government with the belief of a lot of Americans that the government is too big? So does the reform of government include the downsizing of government? And how can both objectives be achieved at the same time? Whoever wants to take it.
Well, I would just underscore the deep political divisions in our country. There's just too much money in the system that actually creates an incentive for these divisions. And I think some really serious reform has to take place in that respect. But some of these ideas are so practical. I would add one more thing about the ideas, especially around strategy, is that we have to empower people to be creative. We used to be very creative historically in this country. As we know, the extraordinary Marshall Plan after World War II and other things that we did. But there's not enough imagination around these disruptors to start with. I would like to just add one thing. I completely agree with you, Harlan, about many, many things in this book. But you hit one of my favorite topics, which is drones. Where's our imagination? This could be turned against us very easily, as you outline in your book. But why wouldn't we have an incentive to create some kind of regulations that helped this country manage this problem? This would be the easiest way to take out public figures, to take out individuals on the streets of Washington. And why do we think that wouldn't happen after what happened to us on 9/11?
So have the advantages of the drone, but drone technology, but try to avoid the disadvantages.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. But as was pointed out, there are not adequate regulations that bring about some order to
and
this.
Probably the same applies to Dov's point about social media, et cetera, that, of course, we are going to run against powerful interests. It's going to become a simple tagline, all regulation is bad, et cetera. And so that will be an issue, which brings me to my second question, which I think, Dov, you may want to answer, and Harlan can jump in. How do you get it through with this political environment? How do you get people to say, hey, there are common sense solutions, and let's think about them. Let's think about them in a bipartisan way instead of everybody digging their heels in and making everything into a polarized ideological debate?
Well, there are some things you're not going to be able to do. You're not going to be able to get rid of gerrymandering as much as you would like to. You're not going to get rid of primaries where the only people who vote are the activists, the extremes on both sides. But you can get more people to go out and vote in primaries. So that's number one. We don't do enough to get those people to come out. And what do you want? You want to elect moderates in both parties. You also have a growing number of independents. One of the things, for instance, that has happened since Trump was president is that people have left the Republican Party. and become independents.
And they've also left the Democratic Party.
And they've left the
apparently, yeah.
Democratic Party and become independents.
So a lot more people are registering as independents.
That's
than
right.
as
So you've got a vehicle, but people have to vote. We have a terrible percentage. I mean, we think it's great if 50% of the country votes. You know,
But
look at some of the
shouldn't that
Europeans.
involve making voting simpler and easier? For example, I have always been surprised since I was not born in this country at the fact that there is a complex process of registration for voting in certain states, whereas in many countries, if you are an adult, you are automatically registered. So why was this put in place? I have no idea of the historic origins of this. Why must a person first go through the hoop of registering, then of voting? And a few people probably find it very difficult to go through both hoops.
Well, you could try to do something. I mean, I think the states would push back very hard. But even so, I mean, registration isn't the most difficult thing in the world. We also have mail-in voting now. There are ways to do this. And I think what this is why people really need to read Harlan's book, because they need to be motivated to get out there. They're part
It's
of
about
this.
their lives,
It's
basically.
about
They have to
them.
understand that politics is
it's
something
it's
about their
their
lives.
survival, their health, their wealth, their children's education,
Their security.
the basics, their security. And so that is, to me, the way you start to get a different face to Congress.
Okay.
Different people coming in. There are various groups that are trying to do that now with greater or lesser success. Let's see what happens even in this election. I mean, months ago, people thought that there would be a landslide on the Republican side, but not just a Republican landslide, a landslide of Trump-type supporters, most of whom are the equivalent of the 1850s Know-Nothing Party. It doesn't look that way anymore. Okay. It looks much more like the kinds of people that her granddad was. Now, let's see what happens. Maybe I'm wrong, but we have to work at that. It's critical to make much of what Harlan says doable. That's on the legislative side. Executive branch, that can be done very quickly.
Okay,
I've been
Harlan.
relatively silent because I think it's important for your viewers to listen to two people who have not written a book, but who are admittedly very, very good friends, but have come up with their conclusions. The American public has to be motivated. The term existential means life-threatening. Americans have got to realize that while their lives may not be directly threatened, their livelihoods are, that we're moving in the wrong direction. I've also
Well,
argued...
that public opinion polls indicate that most Americans feel that the country
Well,
is
yeah,
going
but
in the
that's
wrong
not enough. 75% think we're going in the wrong direction. How do you then motivate people to take action, in part by voting? I have argued that we need universal voting, meaning that people have got to show up at the polls, period. Countries do this. There's a lot of resistance to it. But that is the only way you're going to be able to deflect the pressures from the left and the pressures from the extreme right, which are dangerous. You have a minority of Americans who are influencing politics, and Americans have got to engage. Now, for those Americans say, look, I'm really busy, I'm working 2 or 3 jobs, the inflation, gas prices, all these things do not give me enough time.
So you want to eliminate the gap between registered voters and likely voters?
Everybody has got to show up in primaries as well. Whether they vote or not, or they put down Husain Haqqani or Susan Eisenhower or Dov Zakheim makes no difference. They've got to show up. They've got to be engaged. How do we do that? First of all, I think, and this is not in the book, the only thing that Joe Biden can do and must do, because he's the only president we have, is after the election,
Until 2024.
the only president we have right now.
Right.
He has to bring the leadership of the new Congress together, lock them at Camp David, throw the keys and cell phones away, and come up with a few basic things that need to be done to get us going in the right direction. One is to correct the 1887 Electoral Voting Act, and that has to be done because that's a ticking time bomb. 2, we've got to come up with a budget. And 3, we've got to come up with some agreed policies.
Is that even politically realistic?
It has to be. What's the option? We've got to say something about immigration. The borders are not secure. The borders are not secure. We need some kind of an economic policy, at least minimal. So there are 2 or 3 or 4 things that can be done. Lyndon Johnson were president, and the difference between today and when Johnson was president, Johnson, when he was leader of the Senate, his closest friend was Ev Dirksen, senator from Illinois, a Republican. Lyndon actually contributed to Dirksen's reelection campaign. Can you imagine Chuck Schumer contributing to Mitch McConnell? That's how politics have
I can't imagine
changed.
Chuck Schumer contributing to anybody's campaign. But
Well, he actually has. But the point is, the only way we're going to be able to start this has to come from the president, because he is the leader of the country. Now, he's conflicted. The president, unlike the queen, or the king now in England, is head of state, head of government, head of party, and leader of the nation.
Yeah.
Leader of the nation and head of party conflict. Now, Susan's grandfather, President Eisenhower, said he was not going to be the leader of the party. But of course, he would not have let any leader party do things that he did not want. Biden has got to disassociate himself as much as he can from leader of the party to say, I'm putting my country above this, and this is what we have to do.
and that would apply to anybody else as well as president.
Anybody.
Yeah.
On top of that, we need to have some kind of a grouping in both houses of Congress, and there are some groups of Republicans and Democrats who actually believe we are in an existential condition. And Ukraine should be underscoring that, along with all the other acts of massive disruption that are taking place, that needs to require bipartisanship. It's got to start in the White House, and it's got to start in Congress, and then we've got to mobilize people. This is probably the biggest challenge this country has ever faced, certainly since 1861, and certainly since World War II. And the reason it's so difficult, World War II, we had two demonic threats. We had Germany, Japan, and to a lesser degree, Italy. We then mobilized the country, and we could do it. We were turning out thousands of airplanes a day. We mobilized 12 million troops. I mean, this country was extraordinary in what it did. Why can't we do that now? It requires leadership. It's got to start in the White House, and it's got to start on the Hill, and people have to demand better government. Now, some will say that's wishful thinking, and if we don't do it, I will guarantee you two things will happen. Our standards of living will decline dramatically, and America of the future will not be an America in which you, I, and all of us would want to live in.
Yeah.
That's where we're headed, and we got to recognize that, and that's the basic argument of the book, and we can do something to fix it.
You know, I would just add that I think one of the critical issues here is that we need to reframe what we're talking about. And Harlan's book does a wonderful job of this. But if you really think about the divisions in this country, we're really relitigating the past. We're only talking about the past, really. We want to, again, the word again is used all the time, not just by Republicans, but by Democrats too. You know, we're relitigating the past. What we have to do is start thinking about the challenges of the future. And then back to the points you make in your book, Harlan, that are so critically important, is about how is the government organized to manage the new challenges, as opposed to, citing legal precedent, which of course is important for rule of law, but isn't necessarily important for the way the government is run. I mean, you have to, consolidate certain things, as we discussed, but also we have to have the capacity to be imagining what it means to have unregulated areas of the future. What about AI? We haven't even touched on that in this session today. AI and CRISPR and all of these other technological developments. We just haven't even gotten a handle about what it's going to mean to be a human being 20 years from now or 40 years from now.
We've also got another issue, which is the media, at least as I see it, has become so impossibly partisan, so that it stokes the extremists.
Well, it benefits from that as well, because it
Of
gets
course.
a particular constituency,
And
and
I
that's where
think
the money is.
There needs to be pressure especially from the president. People will come to the White House if they're told to come to
So
the White
Dov,
House.
as a survivor of the three-month long confirmation process, do you see the partisanship, the polarization diminishing anytime soon in a realistic way?
It could. I mean, look, for example, at McConnell and Schumer seem to agree on the 1887 law and the need to reform it. I think that a lot of people, particularly in the Senate, where you don't have small districts that vote exactly, for a Marjorie Greene or somebody like that, or an Ilhan Omar, states are much more heterogeneous. And so the Senate could be a place where they could take the lead. But on the media issue, you know, if you hold up a screen, and when I work out sometimes, the place where I work out has 2 screens. And the conservatives always have Fox on, and the liberals always have MSNBC on. And I'm watching these 2 things, and it's like it's 2 different planets. Now, who's going to get these people to recognize that you're not supposed to be a mouthpiece for the extremists?
Well, they would argue that we are not.
There's only one person who can do that, President of the United States.
But they argue that they are not mouthpieces for extremists. They are actually representing the new mainstream. And that people like you and me and Harlan and Susan are probably out of date because we don't recognize what the new mainstream in this country is.
The comeback is, I don't know how you can have a mainstream when Fox is saying A and MSNBC is saying B. Well, who's the mainstream? Is it Fox or is it MSNBC?
Right.
The answer is it's neither.
Okay.
And I think that's what Harlan has been driving
Look,
at.
one of the problems is that truth and fact no longer exist. And how we get back to that is going to be very difficult. It's opinion, it's emotion, problem. But we also need common sense. As Dov said about his confirmation period, what is a major country in Europe that is in war in Ukraine that does not have an American ambassador? Russia. We have no ambassador there. That is bizarre. We talk about reforming the executive branch. We have a Department of Agriculture. How many independent farmers do we have in the country today? They're not statistically relevant. We have a Department of Energy that doesn't get into energy, it gets into nuclear power. We have a Department of Education when the issue is learning and knowledge. So you could transform the executive branch, you could slim it down and make it far more sensible. Department of Interior, where's our Department of Resources, human and physical? We don't do that. So our organization, as Dov points out, could be fixed tomorrow. We could fix the Pentagon. The Pentagon, the way it's organized, regionally and functionally, is entirely different from the CIA, State Department, everybody else. So when you have a meeting at the White House for national security, you got, I won't say 12 million people, but because every department is organized differently, you've got people who don't necessarily meet. So there are common sense things that a president could do easily. And so these are steps that could be made. And I think the Senate is a place to start, but Congress is a place to start by demanding certain things. Yesterday, Dov and I were at a meeting on the Black Sea, Ukraine, Black Sea. We have no Black Sea strategy.
No, we have no strategy.
Why? Well, let's just get on the Black Sea.
Thank you.
Why? Some of us have been arguing for that for 5 or 6 years. All right, why doesn't NATO or our supreme allied commander in Europe on his own come up with a strategy? There are things that people can do if you unleash the innovative spirits. And that's one thing that a president can do. And as I said, we only have one president at a time. And so Joe Biden has got to pick up the leadership burden and at least bring people around him to do that. Take, for example, Ukraine. Who are the people that best know Putin, right? Henry Kissinger, John Kerry, and Bill Burns. How many of those are being tapped regularly for their knowledge? I doubt Bill Burns is, because he's director of CIA and we don't want to get him in the lane of the State Department or the National Security Advisor. Have Kissinger and Kerry been asked to contribute some way, shape, or form, maybe as envoys? I can speak for one of them. The answer is no. Why not? This is common sense. This is not building the pyramids. It's not rewriting the Constitution. And so common sense is something that I think people need to raise. And people on the Hill should be asking these basic questions to get answers.
Well, it's an interesting discussion. I will let everyone have a final word before we conclude. Dov, do you have anything to add?
Yeah. One of the things that Harlan is trying to do is to have everything brain-based. But to be brain-based, you need brains. And one of the problems we've got, and again, this is something that the president and the White House can take charge of. We're not getting the best people into administrations.
But part of it is also what some people have written about, how expertise has actually been devalued in the country, because in the political discourse, in a partisan discourse, somebody whose sympathies are Republican, but at the same time, he is a little more, or he or she is a little more willing to consider the other side's point of view, they are marginalized from the discussion because they don't belong in the tribe.
Look, they're devaluing meritocracy.
Yeah.
If you're not, you can't talk about the best and the
And
brightest
populism always
if
attacks.
you don't have the best and the brightest.
Populism always attacks expertise.
This is something that the White House can do. When they put forward nominees, yeah, they have to pay off some people, but the number of so-called political appointees, which really means people who gave a lot of money to the party, that's skyrocketed.
Yeah.
And it's not only at the top levels, because the people who really count are the ones who write the memos that the secretaries sign. And those people aren't the best and the brightest anymore either.
And expertise should not be denigrated as elitism. That's an important point.
Look,
Susan?
you're not going to be able to do the things that Harlan says you should do with a bunch of mediocrities. It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Susan, final comments?
Well, also, yes, I'm very interested in the organizing for success, organizing for the future. How do some of these matters get taken up? Who are the leaders? We clearly have a leadership crisis in this country. Who are the leaders going to be? You know who could be the deciding bloc? If anybody wants to go out there and talk to them, the independent voters of the United States of America, 40% of people who vote are registered independent. That's more than both the Democrats and the Republicans. Of course, that number shifts, but it is still today larger than either Republicans or Democrats. I'm a registered independent, and nobody's talking to me. I'm ready with an open mind to hear about who's coming along and who can do this.
Who offers solutions rather than who just presses your buttons.
This is a massive political opportunity for someone. My grandfather called it the middle way. Let's go out and talk to the people who don't find any solutions residing in either party.
Harlan, final comments.
First, I am extremely grateful. After hearing the comments from Susan and Dov, I would say I wish I had read that book or written it because I learned a great deal, and I'm really grateful. I thought this was a really extremely informative and important discussion, and I hope it will be widely viewed. Let me conclude with this in a bittersweet way. The most trenchant line in the Declaration of Independence is a couple of bars down. It says, when government becomes destructive, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and establish a new one. This was good in 1776, and we did. Maybe some people think we should not have. But today, we're almost approaching that. We see people who want to disestablish the government. Today, I would amend that to say when government becomes destructive, it is the right and responsibility of the American people to fix it. And what I'm calling on is the American people, elected and otherwise, to understand that the threats are indeed existential to our standards of living and way of life, and it is up to us to demand solutions. As I said, if we don't do that, I don't think the United States is going to implode as the Soviet Union did, but I do think the future is a future in which none of us would like to live, and I think that would be worse than 1,000 pities and disservices to future generations.
Thank you very much, the Honorable Dov Zakheim, Susan Eisenhower, Dr. Harlan Ullman. The book we have been discussing is The Fifth Horseman and the New Mad, How Massive Attacks of Disruption Became the Looming Existential Danger to a Divided Nation and the World. Thank you.